I just don't buy this sort of Britain can't operate outside of Europe. Britain doesn't lead in the world sort of rhetoric that Gina constantly pumps out.
No, I say it's a transition that we need and a proper plan. We don't have a transition plan.
Good evening, panel. It appears the UK will have to renegotiate its relationship with the EU in order to save its car manufacturing industry. What would the UK have to offer that would sweeten the deal for the EU, considering all those many manufacturing jobs that might go to the EU?
OK. Stephen Morgan.
So I think Off is referring to electric car issues that were... of
I think
importance in Parliament today.
who I didn't actually realise that Vauxhall now owns Fiat.
So Stellantis,
Peugeot,
which is a big car owner,
Citroën.
they own all these brands.
They are worried about that, but I think there are more issues at stake here rather than just electric cars.
I mean, just on electric cars, I think deeply worrying news, and I think the government should have seen this coming. Keir has clearly said that we need to make Brexit work and want to bring down some of the barriers that are existing for trade. But the government have got to take action here. We've got to protect British jobs. We've got to.
But what can we offer the EU to encourage them to come to a deal on this?
Well, I think we've just got to negotiate, haven't we? We've got to sit down, get around the table and find something that works. We've got to invest in Britain. We've got to support research work. We're really clear that we want to invest in green jobs, and we've got an industrial strategy to make that happen. The government haven't got an industrial strategy, and I think that's why we're in some of the mess that we're in.
But if you were the leaders of France, Germany, Spain, Italy, all of whom have big car industries, wouldn't you be licking your lips and thinking, well, the Brits have made their bed, they can lie in it. There's nothing that they can give us that we would want to come to an agreement on this?
Well, I mean, that's the challenge we face out of the European Union, isn't it? But we've got to find a way to make this work that's good for our economy.
Well, many would say that what would be good for our economy would be to go back into the EU, and if Labour offered proper leadership, that's what Keir Starmer should stand up and say.
Well, I was a Remainer. I campaigned for a people's vote, but, we've moved on since then. We've got to make sure Brexit now works, and Keir set out his 5-point plan to make that happen.
OK. Kate?
Yeah, I think it's about promoting brand Britain, isn't it? And finding new and different ways to make those connections and make it beneficial for companies to be here, whether that's tax breaks or what, so that we can get jobs in, and just creating that sort of that environment where people want to come here and that we can get those jobs in rather than going back and negotiating backwards and forwards. It's like you say, it's already been done. So.
Gina?
It's not been done, and it's pie in the sky to think you can't. It's not about going back. It's about the reality. It's about the reality of what we're facing, and business sector after sector are suffering from lack of skilled workforce. They're suffering from barriers to trade. Bloomberg, all the experts, LSE, all of them are saying that we're in for a tough time. We actually haven't seen the worst yet because there was a bit of a rolling back of the full implications when the pandemic was on. But, in business investment, it's down 19% compared to the G7 average. We're looking at...
what was it before Brexit?
Before Brexit, it was closer to 27. So we're down, already. And this is only the beginning.
Well, 19 down is better than 27 down.
No, from 27%. So we're down 19% from that.
Okay.
So also we've got, Bloomberg saying that we're looking at about a 100 million a year, $1 billion a year deficit going forwards when it comes to trade. When people talk about not going back, this is not about going back. This is about going forwards to a relationship where we reduce the damage, because we can't go back in. We have to find a better way of actually trading with the EU, and whilst we also do other trade deals around the world. But when you remember that the arch Brexiteers, the architects of Brexit, Mr Farage, Mr Hannand, Mr Frost, all wanted us to be members of the single market. They originally never said in any of this that we were supposed to leave the single market. And because everyone got caught up in this, including Boris, who said, the night after, what have we done? Because we got caught up in this, they went to a much more extreme Brexit without any plan, any real understanding of what the impact would be on sectors and industries. And we have got to be honest about this.
But answering Ulf's question here, what can we offer the EU to encourage them on this issue, on the Vauxhall issue, to come to a new agreement?
It's not about the EU. It's about us saying that we have to actually show the EU that we act in good faith, that we have a stable government, that we're not politicising everything, that we stand by the rule of law, both internationally and also from a moral point of view. It is showing that we are grown-ups. When we can prove that and we can act in good faith, we can get round the table and negotiate, because it's got to be a win-win for both sides. That's the whole point of negotiating.
Don't you think that Rishi Sunak he's got a very different approach to Liz Truss and Boris Johnson?
He has got a very different approach, but then it doesn't help today in some of the things he said in Japan. It doesn't help what his Home Secretary is saying.
He said in Japan?
That the Brexit benefits are, and then rolled out that the scrapping EU law was a way to show that Brexit was benefiting us. Well, there is no evidence of that.
Richard Holden.
Well, I'm just going to fundamentally disagree with a lot of what Gina's just said. And the idea that Britain doesn't stand by the rule of law or has shown that it doesn't is obviously nonsense. And
it does, but in a specific and limited way.
Well, I think if we look more broadly about what the biggest issue that's facing Europe at the moment and standing by the rule of law, it was Britain that led the way in response to the recent crisis in Ukraine. When the German government wanted to send helmets, we'd already been training Ukrainian soldiers for years and were stepping up with sending arms and leading the way. I say that's standing by the rule of law rather than trying to, as others initially did, try and weasel round and protect their own self-interest.
But on this specific issue.
So I think that's an important point to make there. The idea that Britain doesn't stand tall in the world, I think, is nonsense. And I think actually we led the way in Europe on that. So I think it's just a point worth making. On the broader point around rules of origin, I actually know quite a lot about this because I've got Nissan just down the road from my constituency, and it's one of the biggest employers of my constituents, and I did a lot of speaking to them when we were going through this at earlier stages. I don't know the specifics of what's being discussed around this specific car manufacturer at the moment. All I know is that Nissan were able to put £1 billion of investment into Sunderland, tick all the boxes of this combination of UK and EU rules of origin. If there's something that needs to be done there, we put some government support into that as well at the time, around £100 million and for £1 billion investment, delivering high-skill manufacturing jobs in the northeast of England for decades to come. I don't know the specifics of why this is the case here. So I'd be really interested to see it. And I know that Kemi has already said that she's looking at this in depth at the moment. But I think there are things that we can do differently outside the EU, which can benefit the country as well. You can look at the rules around Solvency II reform, which is being looked at the moment around what we can invest in as a country and what our financial services can invest in. Looking at some of the other deals we're able to do around the world, which we wouldn't have been able to do when we're in the EU as well, whether that's the Japanese trade deal or now looking towards the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Which is 0.1%. That's what's predicted to give our GDP. The CPTPP, of all the experts have said, it will contribute 0.1%.
But there are things we can do outside the EU that we couldn't have done inside the EU, and I'd be very interested to know the full details of this, because when I got stuck in with Nissan to help them out at that point, it turned out that actually the problems which they initially thought might be there were not as prominent as they were later, and in fact it led to a major investment into the Envision battery manufacturing plant just down the road from my constituency.
What's happened to that battery plant now?
I mean, it's operating fully, as far as I'm aware.
There was a battery plant there that went out of business, wasn't there?
There was a proposal for one north of Tyne. I mean, right. I know Gina probably, she doesn't probably know the northeast as well as I do, but there's one which is being looked at north of Tyne. But the one at Sunderland looks to be doing really well and has a massive potential for growth, and as well as we look at other things. And I just don't buy this sort of Britain can't operate outside of Europe. Britain doesn't lead in the world sort of rhetoric that Gina constantly pumps out.
No, I say it's a transition that we need and a proper plan. We don't have have a transition plan.
No, well, I don't think that's true. And the way you talk about the country as some form of, state which doesn't back the rule of law, when people come in here internationally to use our legal system, which is, world renowned.
They keep threatening to break international law.
When we, as the ones who stand up for international law in countries like Ukraine, it just gets really boring when you're constantly talking the country down.